This is the installation video for the OTRC SCX24 Portal Upgrade. Before we get started with the portal installation, we're going to reverse the polarity of the motor because adding gearing to the portals reverses the direction of the wheels. And the controller for the SCX24 does not have a reversing switch for the throttle channel. Go ahead and remove the body pins and lift up the body to access the receiver. You'll need a hobby knife or something similar. We're going to unplug the motor connector from the receiver and pry up the small white tabs in order to switch the wire position in the connector. The front connector is the battery. Do not modify the battery connector. Unplug the motor connector located at the rear of the receiver. Use your hobby knife to gently pry up on the tab securing the red wire. This will release it. Now release the black wire in the same manner and put the red wire in its place. Check to make sure the wires are securely latched back in place by lightly tugging on them. And plug the connector back into the receiver. You can test your work by turning the transmitter and model on, and when pulling the trigger in the normal forward direction, the wheels turn in reverse, but the steering still continues to work normally. Shown is the full standard kit and the tools required to perform this installation. Tool-wise, you'll need a hobby knife to cut apart the plastic portal bodies, a 4mm nut driver, a 1.3mm hex driver, and I'm using a white lithium grease from the auto parts store, but any high-quality grease like Tri-Flow or a hobby store gear lube will be required to lubricate the brass gears during installation and during servicing once a year thereafter. Lastly, a small pair of pliers or tweezers will help in inserting the small pins into the axle holes. Now real quickly identifying the pieces of the kit, you have two rear portal backing plates. These mount to the stock rear axle tubes. Two front steering knuckles. These are not symmetrical. There is a left and right. We'll go over that during the build. Finally, you have two different versions of portal covers. They are the same front and rear, but one set we're calling stock and requires no modification, and the other requires a mod. The stock version is designed with two through holes in the cover. This is the set we'll be installing today, so in this install we'll only be using the top row of covers from each set, saving the lower rows for a later video. You also got 4 flanged bearings that are installed in the back of the portal covers. They go here and here. You have 4 radial bearings. These are installed in the lower journals of the rear backing plates and steering knuckles. One each here and here, and one each here and here. As a side note, the upper journals of the steering knuckles, back and front, will reuse the bearings from the stock SCX24 steering knuckles. We'll also go over this again during the installation later. You have 4 lower output axles. After installation, the wheels will attach to these shafts. You have 8 axle pins, 2 for each of the output shafts just mentioned. We'll be reusing the stock pins with the stock axles. There are 12 1.4 by 8 mm machine screws. 3 will secure each portal cover to its other half. There are 8 total brass gears, 2 per portal. All of the gears are identical, though I may have some upside down here, but each is flat on one side and has a slot milled into the other so that it can slide down over the pin that will be in the shaft, locking it into place. And finally, 4 nylon lock nuts. We'll use these on the supplied output axles, reusing the stock nuts on the stock upper shafts. Our patient today is a completely stock SCX24, and we'll be starting with the rear wheel as it has slightly fewer parts to deal with. The concept is the same front and rear. Doing the rear will let you get your feet wet with the simpler of the 2 installations. For clarity and a little organization, I've put all of the parts from the kit in my left bowl, and I'm using the right bowl to keep the stock parts separated and for reuse. So let's go ahead and get started. Remove the rear nylon lock nut using the 4 mm nut driver. Remove the wheel, the plastic retaining nut, and use the pliers to remove the pin from the shaft. Using the 1.3 mm hex driver, remove both screws from the axle and save those in the stock parts bowl as well. Now we'll mount a rear portal backing plate to the axle. Notice there is a front and back side. The bearing will need to go in this journal, facing out in the lower position. The stock axle will go through the top, smaller hole. Let's go ahead and place the portal backplate on the axle tube and reuse the stock screws we just removed to secure it to the axle tube. Be sure not to drop the screw like I just did. I'll grab that one in a minute. Do not over tighten the screws. Next, place the radial bearing, not the flange bearing, into the lower bearing journal of the portal backplate we just installed. It's not a tight fit, it will press right in. Now replace the stock axle pin into the stock axle. Now we need to prepare a new axle. Using one of the 2 supplied shaft pins, install it in the hole furthest away from the threads. Now we'll install one of the brass gears over the shaft onto the pin. Ensure the brass gear has the slot facing the pin as you slide it over the threaded end of the axle, and press it completely onto the pin, locking the gear from spinning freely on the axle. Once the gear is fully seated on the pin, go ahead and put the shaft into the lower bearing. This is where we need to apply some grease. Apply a bead all the way around the lower gear. Now install the second gear over the stock output shaft and pin previously installed. You can make sure the gears are fully seated by viewing from the side and making sure that they are against the portal backplate and that the gears are aligned. Add another bead of grease around the upper gear and pack it with your finger. Using your 4mm nut driver, replace the stock nylon lock nut that originally held on the wheel to the top stock output shaft. The next step is to install the portal cover. We'll start by installing the flanged bearing into the bottom bearing journal from the inside of the portal cover. I'm using the 4mm nut driver to seat the bearing fully. It doesn't take much pressure, but my fingers are too big to press it in by hand. Now fit the cover over the prepared axle assembly and use 3 1.4 by 8mm screws to seal the gearbox. Do not over-tighten these screws. So that's the installed portal. All that's left to do is just install the wheel. But if you did everything right, this is what your rear portal should look like. All that's left to do is take the final supplied axle pin and slide it into the output shaft. Take the stock plastic wheel retaining nut and push it over the shaft pin. Replace the wheel, making sure it fits over the plastic hex nut. And use the supplied lock nut to secure the wheel to the output shaft. Now, to test your work, you can turn on the model, and if you've already performed step 1, reversing the motor wires, when you pull the trigger in the forward direction, the rear wheel will spin in the correct direction. Of course, the front wheel will continue to spin in reverse until we install the front portal. I didn't cover this part on the rear portal installation, 1 because I'd already separated the parts, but 2 because it's a little more obvious on the rears. But on the fronts, you'll need to separate the steering knuckles from the mold supports at the ends of both rectangular supports. Here's a properly separated steering knuckle. You can use sandpaper to clean up the cuts a little, as it will show, but it's not necessary to install properly. Notice I'm starting on the front right side of the vehicle. The steering knuckles are not symmetrical, so if you're following along, you may want to work on the right side as well. Just as with the rear, begin by removing the front wheel and saving the stock nylon lock nut in the stock parts bowl. Remove the plastic retaining nut and pin and put those in the stock parts bowl as well. Now we need to remove the entire stock steering knuckle. There's a screw in the top, the bottom, and then you need to remove the ball joint screw from the steering linkage. The ball will stay in the link and the whole steering knuckle will come off in your hands. We'll need to reuse the shaft and bearings from the stock steering knuckle, so go ahead and remove the shaft and the bearing on it and save it in the stock parts bowl. You can leave the other bearing and the steering knuckle for now. We'll come back to it later. I mentioned earlier that the steering knuckles are not symmetrical. To identify the right knuckle, if you hold it so that the through hole is to the top, and the knuckle installs in this manner with the 2 bearing journals facing yourself, then the steering linkage arm sticks out to the right. As I said, you're also going to need to reuse the dog bone receiver axle and bearings from the original steering knuckle. So when you took out the dog bone axle, you should have left the bearing on the shaft. You can now take that small assembly and just insert it into the portal steering knuckle from the inside. It just presses in. Now we need to get that second bearing from the original steering knuckle. It should easily pop out using our hex or nut driver. Take that bearing and press it onto the other side of the portal steering knuckle onto the original dog bone axle. So now this assembly is ready to install. If you've never had your SCX24 apart before, you'll need to make sure that the slot in the axle receiver is lined up to the dog bone shaft. You can see here that the dog bone is lined up going along the 2 o'clock to 8 o'clock axis. Once the steering knuckle is in position, you'll use the original screws you removed from the stock steering knuckle to secure the portal steering knuckle to the vehicle. Don't screw them in too tightly. You want the knuckle to still move freely left to right. I'll install the steering linkage later after the portal cover is installed, but before installing the wheel. The next step is to install the stock pin back in the stock dog bone receiver axle that we just replaced. Use your pliers or tweezers to center the pin in the shaft. The portal assembly from here is identical to the rear portal assembly, but I'll cover it again for completeness. Install the flanged bearing into the lower journal of the portal cover, again using the 4mm nut driver to seat the bearing fully. Press the supplied radial bearing into the lower journal of the steering knuckle. And now we prepare the axle as before. Install one of the supplied pins into the hole opposite the end of the threads, and press one of the brass gears over the threads with the notch facing the pin we just installed. Ensure the pin is fully seated onto the gear. Place the prepared shaft into the lower bearing. And now the upper gear can be installed onto the stock dog bone output shaft. Same as before, you can tell if the gears have been fully seated onto the pins by inspecting from the side to verify the gears are touching the portal backplate and that the gears are aligned with one another. Replace the stock nylon lock nut and install on the upper shaft. You may notice I'm greasing the gears in a different order than the rears. As long as you have a good bead of grease around both gears, the installation will be fine. Fit the portal cover with the flange bearing already installed from the previous step. And secure it to the steering knuckle using the 3 1.4 by 8mm screws, remembering not to over-tighten them. Now you can replace the steering linkage arm. You may have to apply a little pressure to the ball as the screw is cutting the threads into the steering arm. All that's left to do now is take the remaining supplied pin and install it into the exposed hole in the lower output shaft. Slide the stock plastic wheel retaining nut over the pin. Seat the wheel onto the nut. And the supplied nylon lock nut secures the wheel to the axle. Testing your work again, you'll see that the steering should work properly, and throttle forward now results in the two portal wheels spinning in the forward direction. To complete installation, simply follow the same instructions again for the other side of the vehicle.